Hello, Ninth Heretic here. With this final episode on the cycladic vessels, I want to close that topic off with what I found quite intriguing, namely a possible link between Karnak, Britannia, and the ancient cultures of Serbia and Bulgaria. Not immediately swastika related, but still an attempt to sketch a part of the world in which the symbol was used, or in this case, some claim it to have been used. The real origins and the real meaning of the swastika is a quest that many have on their minds. I think that there is not just one answer to either question. The symbol is too ancient and too diffuse to be able to pin it down with one single explanation. But I wondered if it is possible to gather, say, circumstantial evidence that possibly allows us to get a broader perspective on its where and whatabouts, so to say. I find there is always something coming up worthy of sharing here. So in parts 1 and 2, we looked at the hypothesis of the vessels being used to track the synodic periods of Moon, Venus, and other planets of our solar system that were known at that time. We also explored the possibility that the vessels themselves, filled with a liquid, were also used to observe phenomena like the eclipses, similar as the neuralgic wells in Sardinia. I mentioned the hypothetical neolithic telescope using obsidian mirrors, adding some examples from around the world, and ended with the use of the camera lucida by the honored old Flemish masters or European masters of the art world, as proposed by Hockney. This time I want to start off by mentioning a paper from independent researcher Richard Heath, which is called A Minoan Calendar of Bronze Age Time. It was first published in 2004, and that is about 10 years before the proposal which I started with in episode 13a. Richard Heath has already recognized that at least one vessel could have been used to track the synodic motion of Saturn, adding how this could attest for a Greek instead of a Mesopotamian origin of the 7-day week. It's a nice read as he summarizes the sequence from observance and marking of celestial movements happening around 30 or 40,000 years ago and carved into bone and rock. How this developed into calendars that could be used to actively predict these movements. He is clearly knowledgeable in a way that his perspectives and ideas sound, at least to me, refreshing within the general tone of alternative historical research and its publishing industry. Instead of rehassling his work, I invite you to check out his channel and cite yourselves, links in the show notes under the video. He has published a load of work on numbers and archeo-astronomy. Here is a piece of a short video from his YouTube channel in which he talks about this particular lid.
Saturn has a relationship of 16 units to 15 units to the lunar year, and so they deduced a way of counting days round the outside and working out the movement of the eclipse nodes from counting days of the week, which seven divides into Saturn's synodic period, which is the period that Saturn takes to get into the same relationship to the Sun in a year. So embodied in this is a relationship of number, in which a number of celestial bodies have a relationship in time. And it's almost certainly the case that this kind of Saturnian observation enabled the 7-day week to emerge, both for the Jews in Babylon and the Greeks in Greece, of course. So,
for some reason he does not address the vessel itself, just the lid. Apart from a slight mention, I have not seen any researcher go deeper into the possible use of the frying pans to observe moon or sun. He calls the lid the disk of Saturn, and I can only assume that he was at that time unaware of the other variations. Yet there is other examples of vessels that were presumably used as astronomical tools. This one is supposedly used for eclipse watching, the solar chalice. The explanation goes that the holes in the rim were used to view the solstices, given that the bowl remained unmoved for a long time. I tried to find anything confirming this, but abandoned that search, so I don't know whether this is actual fact or not. It is supposed to have been used by the catacomb culture of East Ukraine, southern Russia, and this culture is a collective noun for Indo-European tribes inhabiting that region from the 4th to the end of the 2nd millennium BC. Their battle axes, says Wiki, point to a link with the West, but the short article fails to provide more details on that. It also links them to the Afanasivu, who in their turn are connected to the white mummies of the Taklamakan Desert in China. The catacomb culture had the habit of using death masks, like the famous mask of Agamemnon, or at least that is how the likes of Heinrich Schliemann, renowned archaeologist of the early 20th century, fancied to call his trove. More on Troy and Schliemann later. What is more interesting to me is the link to the Indo-Aryans from Turkmenistan, as some propose, but also that will have to wait for another time. I also want to remind of another simple way of observing an eclipse, which I haven't mentioned yet, namely the pinhole projection. It is easily doable with primitive means. If you want to read more, stop the video. I would like to move on with a few more examples. Next bowl of interest belongs to the Vucedolci culture located in central Croatia from around the 4th millennium. There are a number of ceramics with similar symbols, and they are the oldest European ideograms ever found. In theory, this piece of pottery displays sort of the forerunner of the calendar system we use today. It illustrates the progression of Orion and the solstices. They were actually also the first known to have domesticated the dove. On a side note, the bird was the symbol of their mother goddess. This last one here is a bit odd. I can't find any other source but one. It supposedly represents the underside of one of the cycladic vessels, showing a star map. I did not pursue this neither because I didn't find enough references. If you want to read more, I will leave links in the show notes. But the title of the page hints to another interesting theory going around concerning the cycladic frying pans, away from this astronomical hypothesis, and although that is the one I would prefer, I find the following is certainly worth mentioning. One of the earliest proposals, dating from 1962, concerns the part these vessels may have played in the production of salt cakes or salt money. In short, we go to Brittany, more precisely Morbihan, known for the many alignments in and around Karnak. What is of interest, however, are 4 tumuli, of which the oldest is 7,000 years old. These tumuli have individual graves under them containing a specific kind of pottery unknown to the region during the times that followed. All three of these tumuli, four I mean, are famous for their Neolithic polished axe heads of alpine stone and their beads from the Iberian Varisite. Take note that it is a very long way to go by land as well as by water from the northwest of France all the way to the Alps. Researchers like Serge Cassin propose since long time that the vessels were used in salt production, similar to the practice as performed in many nations worldwide, either by boiling brine in order to evaporate the moist until crystalline salt remains, or the matter would be dried in the sun. They proposed that the brine would be poured into vessels in which it would dry into cakes, and these would be easy to transport and be used for storage or as an exchange currency. Such discs of salt are known to have been produced in Mesopotamia and China. Experimenting with replicas, the team was able to produce a brine, and during a second heating, a salt cake or disc was made very quickly, but no trace of salt, however, was found on the pottery. Other than that, the shoreline during the era was at least 500 meters deeper into the ocean than it is now. Why would a salt maker settle that far away from the source? Then again, the paper mentions a good argument against the mirror hypothesis with the two bronze imitations found in Anatolia and clearly dating to a later period. Like we've seen in earlier episodes, the inhabitants of that region constructed bronze and obsidian mirrors already. Why would they look for another way to capture lunar or solar eclipses? These two pans are rather exceptional within the whole of 100 plus vessels that have been recovered around the Aegean so far, and there is no way to know whether such an observation would be viewed in a shroud of sanctity and ritual, or whether a similar sacred value would have been given to the material used to fabricate the vessels. But the explanation given to the decorations are a disappointment compared to the decoding work of Richard Heath on the so-called Saturn disk and that of the Greek team that decoded the astronomical significance of the other variations. What's more, with the proposition that the vessels were used to create so-called salt disks or cakes, a difficulty emerges to which the authors of the study offer little explanation. One of the four vessels found in Karnak, just like a certain number of cycladic examples, has concave walls or sides, meaning that after drying the cake would sort of get stuck or at least be hard to remove. These concave walls seem to be meant to keep a substance in rather than out, at least that's what I think. They have a few good arguments for why these vessels, both the Karnak examples and the Cycladic ones, were used for salt winning, but their arguments seem less cogent once you have become acquainted with the astronomical hypothesis and see how the other team proposes how the calculations were done. The exact number of indentations, etc., corresponding to synodic periods of our planets cannot be tossed away as a mere coincidence. There is a discussion going on about the similarities between the megalithic site of Brittany's coast and those on the coastlines of the Black Sea, more precisely a region with Indo-Aryan influence, historically known as Alania, Sarmatia, and before Russia occupied the region in the 18th century, it was known as Ossetia. But the megaliths of both regions antedate the so-called salt pans with more than 2 millennia. More in particular, the southeast region of Bulgaria have since Neolithic times been known for its salt mining. Many are familiar with the Varna necropolis, known for the earliest gold treasures on Earth, the so-called Aurolithic civilization of 5000 BC. And this necropolis showed the earliest example of a hierarchical organized society, with elite graves yielding a considerable treasure. The scepter and the golden plaques contain a knowledge of Pythagorean geometry, proving a knowledge system older than the dating of such structures like the Egyptian pyramids. That is the story of a number of independent researchers who studied the objects, but I haven't seen any replies to these claims. The explanation for the presence of such richness in this Varna civilization of 5000 BC, without mentionable resources in the vicinity, can only be explained by the thriving exploitation and trade in rock salt. There have been found several vessels in the region that were undoubtedly used for salt production and look very similar to the Karnak vessels. That is why the salt hypothesis enjoys a lot of international support. Similar with Varna, also in the Briton tumuli, extraordinary objects as grave goods in a minority of graves may point to the existence of the first elites. There are more similarities between Varna and Karnak. There is a marine aspect. Both locations are situated near rivers and oceans or seashores. And both the cultures were clearly involved in long-distance trade, something which is concluded after the first chemical analysis of tools and offerings. I have not seen much work on it so far, but what I do find does sound promising, since archaeologists themselves call for interdisciplinary studies on an international level in order to finally be able to unravel the megalith enigma. Salt. We generally only think about it when there is too few or too much. We have only a small notion of what it has encompassed in the lives of our ancestors. We might consider how the trade in salt is what made a city like Timbuktu in Central African Mali, for example, so prosperous centuries ago, and now there are still salt transports by the Tuareg in traditional ways, but new desert roads destroyed the exclusivity of their ancient trade and profession. There is a saying of obscure origin, "He is not worth his salt," that can be traced back to times of slavery when slaves would be paid for with salt. Salt, slaves, and gold seem to have been closely connected. This text is from the first English translation of the Christian Bible into English by William Tinsdale, and this would eventually cost him his life, so I learned on a side note. The New Testament tells us that Jesus the Nazarene says to his disciples, "You are the salt of the earth," when he names those of great value and worth. They are those who make the ultimate fulfillment of purpose possible after all falsehood has evaporated. Although salt was valuable enough to use as a currency, the meaning of these words is more than just about material riches. Salt is one of those substances that has the ability to maintain itself throughout the transformation processes of heating or dilution. its essence remains the same. This property makes salt one of the three primes of alchemy, together with mercury and sulfur. In alchemy, the word salt is used for more than just sodium. It also stands for minerals with similar properties. The Old Greek word for sea and salt differ in gender, not in the way it is written though. Some sources speak of an esoteric connection between salt and moon. Esotericist Dion Fortune mentioned the evaporation of sea salt or items soaked in seawater in rituals in her last book. She was part of the esoteric high society of her day and also took on membership within the Golden Dawn of Crowley and that GPL guy, Jack Parson. I thought I mentioned that for what it's worth. But whatever that all may, the processes of extracting salt from plants or plant ashes was practiced very early on. I will link this paper on experiments performed by an archaeological team from the UK. Also worth mentioning, gypsum, mineral often connected to salt, is called selenite, also linking it to Selene, one of Moon's many names. It has been used in ritual in slightly different ways, but all concerning the protection of a newborn from many cultures in the Middle East to Western Europe. Egyptians used to bless the premises of monuments with salt when performing the stretching of the gourd ceremony. There is a link to an informative presentation by Sacred Geometry Decoded for more specifics on that. Salt is extensively mentioned in the Book of the Dead, and I can only advise to go see the work that SGD, Sacred Geometry Decoded, has been doing on in this Stretching the Gourd or Heliopolis or Pyramid series. Salt was used in mummification processes. It is generally used for conservation, but also it served already as a medicine and as an ingredient for the manufacturing of artificial stone and glass. The Sea of Sodom is another name for the Dead Sea, known for its salinity and medicinal properties, and it is remarkable that sodium is another name for salt. There are sources that claim that the very word salvation goes back to such rituals of protection and conservation in which salt was used to protect and preserve, or conserve, if you will, the holy precious hidden inside. What is more certain, though, is that the origin of the word salarium, is closely connected. It refers to the habit of paying a certain amount of wage to soldiers in the form of salt, being responsible for their own food and depending on salt to be able to perform the soldiers' duties in battles or on a campaign. It was a necessity. Raising salt taxes are said to have been at the base of the French Revolution and at the base of the Indian Revolution or resistance under Mahatma Gandhi. Taking all this in consideration, I think it is very reasonable to propose that salt winning was one of the possible uses of the cycladic vessels. Maybe these people who knew how to read the flight of the wandering gods, the planets, in the skies, belonged to a well-educated elite. Salt could have made part of their rituals. The magic and rituals that accompanied that which we call physics and basic chemistry nowadays have long eroded, but eventually that magic served what I think was its ultimate goal, and that is protecting the trade and business. There is, of course, too much I could include about salt, but the most important point is that it could very well be that salt winning was associated with the moon, and this all made part of the mindset in which it was produced at that time. You can take all this with as much salt as you want. It has been more than enough already for today. There is one aspect I still haven't addressed though. So this was not really the last episode. I think it will be worthwhile though. Cheers to you all and thanks for watching. See you next time.